Now these are, according to the existentialists, the best starting point for philosophical reflection. In case some of you should wonder, well, what else? Isn't that the obvious way for a philosopher to start? The answer is that the continental rationalists and the British empiricists and the American pragmatists did not start philosophical reflection from experiences like these at all. So here we do have something distinctive, and this starting point is indeed closer to real life and is less academic and less limited in appeal than what many other philosophers do. But in their philosophical discussions of these experiences, of problems raised by these experiences, some of these men, notably Sartre himself and Heidegger, become extremely obscure, extremely technical, and as I've said before, sometimes write in a way that is the despair even of professors and graduate students. If my suggestion is accepted, it has some rather interesting implications. The question is often asked whether existentialism can be traced back to people long, long before Kierkegaard, long before the 19th century. The question is often asked whether, in some sense, perhaps Pascal already was an existentialist, whether perhaps St. Augustine was an existentialist, and whether still much earlier, possibly the author of the book of Job in the Bible did some existentialist writing. And once you invite this sort of question, the sky is the limit, and one may ask about vast numbers of writers where the term should not be applied to them also. And my answer to this would be that the kind of experience that I have described, extreme experiences, ultimate situations, border situations, have been a staple of literature and religion for thousands of years. Indeed, there is one form of literature, tragedy, that perhaps by definition always deals with such situations. And I don't think that it is particularly profitable to call the Greek tragic poets or Shakespeare existentialists. I myself have written a book from Shakespeare to existentialism, in which I deal with Shakespeare and then later on in the book also with some of the existentialists, but there's no implication that it would be particularly useful to call Shakespeare himself an existentialist, and indeed I think it would not. What is distinctive about the existentialists is that material, experiences, motifs that had been central in religion and in literature for thousands of years, here suddenly become a starting point for philosophy. And therefore, if it hadn't been for Heidegger and Jaspers and Sartre, I don't think that any of us would think of Kierkegaard as an existentialist. Perhaps we would not even think of him as a philosopher, but rather we would think of him as he thought of himself as a Christian, a religious writer. And he dealt with motifs that had been a staple of much Christian literature before his time. What is distinctive is that in the 20th century, a number of professional philosophers have decided that the sort of thing that Kierkegaard did was a very reasonable thing for philosophers to do also, and with that it was in the 20th century that existentialism was born. Hence the question about various playwrights, contemporary playwrights or novelists, whether they are existentialist writers is, to my mind, a misguided question. Because the term should not be applied, I think, to mainly literary or religious figures. It is a term that should be applied mainly two philosophers in the way that I have suggested.
Professor Kaufmann, you suggested that, in effect, there is no such thing as a school of existentialism, and that existentialism is itself a repudiation of collective doctrines. So I'd like to ask you then, if in fact the heart of existentialism, as you've written yourself, is anti-school, anti-dogmatic, anti-doctrinal, how then are we to differentiate the various philosophers whom you've named?
There are a number of ways in which one could answer this question. There are a number of things that come together here. First of all, one might say that none of the major philosophers has belonged to a school, that anybody who belongs to a school, that anybody who is mainly a follower is eo ipso not a major philosopher, not a major figure in his own right. And the really important philosophers are none of them members of schools. That would be true of all the ones that I have mentioned so far. That would be one consideration. Secondly, it so happens that the particular four people that I've mentioned as existentialists, Kierkegaard, Heidegger, Jaspers, and Sartre, are all four very individualistic figures. This is very striking in the case of Kierkegaard, who once wrote that the epitaph that he would prefer for himself would be "that individual," and one of the very appealing and intriguing things about Jean-Paul Sartre is that he is also so very much, despite some of his doctrinal opinions, an arch-individualist. So this would be the second consideration. Temperamentally, the so-called existentialists are averse to schools. And then thirdly and lastly, one might say that what these four men have in common, in connection with the extreme, ultimate situations that I have described, is a preoccupation with man in his loneliness, with man in utter solitude. And not only are they interested in reflecting on man in such solitude, but they themselves feel that to be authentic, I'm using a word that has been much used by the existentialists themselves, to be authentic, man must achieve solitude. He must somehow stand by himself. And since they are all four men who are trying to be authentic, since they're all four men who are trying not to merely drown in the anonymous they, in the public one, doing what one does, doing what one is supposed to do, they are, for that reason, too, averse to being members of a school and very individual figures.
Now, when you mention solitude, do you mean both isolation and individuality or self-definition, or do you mean both?
I think I mean both. This, of course, leaves open the other question that you asked before. How can one divide them up? Here we have four people. How might one group them? Might one, among these four, still possibly find two groups of two each, for example? Jean-Paul Sartre, in his lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, made a very ill-advised and hasty attempt to do just that. It's worth mentioning because it has been quite influential. He suggested that confusion has arisen from the fact that there are, as he says, two kinds of existentialism, Christian and atheist. And then he goes on to say, this was in 1946, that examples of Christian existentialism are Kierkegaard, which is fair enough, and Jaspers, whom Sartre goes on to call Roman Catholic, which is simply a mistake. Jaspers had never been a Roman Catholic. He was brought up a Protestant, but his own position would be much more that of an agnostic than that of a Christian. So this is really not quite accurate. And then what Sartre suggested was that on the other hand, there were Heidegger and himself, who were atheists, and Heidegger was not particularly happy about being called an atheist, though one would hardly call him a theist. This way of dividing up the cake seems to me very unhelpful indeed.
Professor Kaufmann, the Christian concept of atonement, if we choose to see it as such, is an at-one-ment with God. Now, would it therefore be possible for a person to be both a Christian and an existentialist, and to see this individuality or this isolation, this ultimate individuality, as being a shared oneness with God? And before
it is possible, and this is of course what Kierkegaard tried to do. And it seems to me that if we use the word existentialism at all, we clearly should include Kierkegaard. If you will, he was the father of existentialism. I've said that existentialism really came into its own in the 20th century, but it goes back to him very much. He gave the decisive impulses, is very important for this whole movement, and he wanted desperately to be a Christian in the highest and most demanding sense of the word, and he felt that to be a Christian within Christendom was devilishly hard, that precisely because there were so many Christians, so-called Christians, lip service Christians, shallow Christians, it was extremely difficult to achieve the state of being a Christian in the more demanding sense. And he felt that this called for extreme solitude, for becoming an individual all alone. Now one might say, as long as one believes in God, one really isn't all alone. Nietzsche suggested that he had achieved the kind of solitude that people who had still believed in God could not even understand. And Nietzsche in turn also exerted a decisive influence on existentialism, not on Kierkegaard of course. Kierkegaard died when Nietzsche was 11 years old, but Nietzsche had an immense influence on Heidegger, who has written several essays as well as a big 2-volume work on him, on Jaspers, who has written on him again and again, including a couple of books, and also on Jean-Paul Sartre. And in Nietzsche too, as I've said, you find this tremendous emphasis on the need for breaking with the crowd, the need for breaking with the herd, and of achieving authenticity all by oneself.